The gown Arabella wore was meant for Prudence. It was a whisper, a rustle of silk and spite that followed her stepsister through the crowded ballroom. But Prudence heard it. She heard it in the way Lady Honora Bellamy, her stepmother, looked from Arabella's shimmering form to Prudence's plain gray wool with a flicker of triumphant satisfaction. The gown was the color of a summer sky at dusk, a deep periwinkle embroidered with silver thread that caught the candlelight and scattered it like captured stars. It had been Prudence's one inheritance from her own mother, a length of silk purchased in Paris, saved for a special occasion that had never come, until now. Honora had declared it the perfect choice for Arabella's debut into Marley society. Prudence had spent the last 3 weeks stitching it, her fingers pricked and sore, her back aching from hunching over the frame in the dim light of her small room. She had even performed a final, desperate repair to a seam Arabella had split just an hour ago, her calm hands working with a speed and precision that went, as always, entirely unpraised. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were a currency her stepmother did not value. Competence, however, was a resource to be exploited. And so, Prudence was not a guest at this ball held in her own home. She was its invisible architect. She stood near the shadowed archway leading to the kitchens, her posture straight, her hands clasped loosely before her. From this vantage point, she could monitor everything. She saw the footman who was drinking a little too freely from the leftover glasses, and caught his eye with a look that was not unkind, but was clear in its instruction. She noted that the musicians would need their payment within the hour, a detail Honora would surely forget, and made a mental note to retrieve the coins from the study desk. She saw the platter of cakes dwindling, and dispatched a maid with a quiet murmur to fetch the next tray. She was a ghost in her own life, a silent engine ensuring the smooth performance of a play in which she had no part. The guest of honor, the reason for this extravagant display, was Gideon Devereux, the Duke of Kestrel Chase. He was a figure of local legend, a man who had returned from the war a hero, and from his marriage a widower, all within 2 short years. Now he lived in splendid isolation at his great estate, a place spoken of in hushed tones as being as cold and silent as its master. He stood near the grand fireplace, a tall, unsmiling man whose presence seemed to absorb the light and sound around him. He did not mingle. He observed. His dark coat was impeccably tailored but severe, a stark contrast to the colorful silks and velvets of the other gentlemen. His gaze swept the room with a flat, dispassionate assessment that made even the most confident socialites feel like specimens under glass. Lady Honora guided Arabella toward him like a prize mare to a judge. Arabella, lovely in her stolen finery, curtsied and stammered a greeting. The Duke inclined his head, his expression unchanging. His eyes, Prudence noted, were not cold, as rumor suggested. They were simply still, as if he had seen too much to be easily moved. Felicity Trent, a local beauty with a fortune of her own, made her own approach, her voice a confection of honeyed charm. The Duke answered her questions with clipped, single-word replies until she, too, retreated in defeat. He seemed utterly immune to the practiced arts of society. Then, a small disaster. A young footman, nervous under the Duke's gaze, stumbled near a priceless Flemish tapestry. A tray of full wine glasses tilted precariously. A collective gasp went through the room. Time seemed to slow. Prudence saw the arc of dark red liquid, the ruinous stain that would follow, the footman's career ending in a single, clumsy moment. Before anyone else could move, she was there. She did not run. She simply arrived, her movements economical and swift. She caught the tipping edge of the silver tray with one hand, her grip surprisingly strong, steadying it before a single drop could fall. With her other hand, she reached for a dish of salted nuts on a nearby table, took a pinch, and gestured to the small splatter that had landed on the polished floor. "Salt, quickly," she murmured to the terrified footman, her voice too low for anyone but him to hear. "It will lift the worst of it before it sets. Then fetch Hannah with a damp cloth." She straightened the tray, gave him a small, reassuring nod, and stepped back into the shadows as if she had never been there at all. The entire event took no more than 5 seconds. Most guests saw only a minor wobble, expertly recovered. But Prudence knew that the Duke of Kestrel Chase had seen it all. His still, watchful eyes had not been on the glittering guests or the pretty girl in the periwinkle gown. They had been on her. He did not smile, nor did his expression change, but he watched her retreat into the archway, his gaze holding on the spot where she had stood for a long moment after she was gone. Later, as the evening waned, Prudence saw him speak to her stepmother. She could not hear his words, but she saw him gesture subtly toward the archway. Lady Honora glanced over, her eyes finding Prudence. A look of annoyance crossed her features. She turned back to the Duke and gave a dismissive little laugh, waving her hand as if brushing away a fly. "Oh, that is no one of importance," she said, her voice carrying in a lull in the music. "Merely Prudence, a poor relation who makes herself useful." The Duke's face remained a mask, but he looked at Honora, then back at the shadows where Prudence stood, and the silence that followed her stepmother's pronouncement was more damning than any rebuke. He had seen a crisis averted with quiet competence, and he had been given an answer of polished cruelty. And in that moment, a seed of interest, hard and clear as a diamond, was planted in the barren ground of his attention. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. It was addressed not to Lady Honora, nor to Arabella, but to Miss Prudence Bellamy. The ducal seal, a stark impression of a kestrel in flight, was unbroken on the back. Honora snatched it from the salver before Prudence could even touch it, breaking the wax with a sharp crack of her thumbnail. Her eyes scanned the page, her perfectly painted lips tightening into a thin line of disbelief, then suspicion. "The Duke of Kestrel Chase," she announced, her voice incredulous, "requests an interview with you for the position of estate archivist and manager of the household accounts." She looked at Prudence as if she had just sprouted a second head. "This is absurd. There must be some mistake." Prudence's heart gave a strange, unfamiliar leap. It was not hope, precisely. It was something closer to the feeling of a locked door swinging open a bare inch, letting in a sliver of light and a breath of fresh air. "Perhaps he was impressed by the household accounts I keep here," she said, her voice even. It was true. She managed every shilling that came in and out of the Bellamy household, stretching Honora's dwindling funds to maintain the illusion of wealth. Her ledgers were a work of art, every entry precise, every column balanced to the last farthing. "He was impressed by your nerve, more like," Honora sniffed. "That ridiculous display with the wine tray. He is an eccentric. This is some peculiar whim." For a day, Honora considered refusing. But greed, as it so often did, won out. The salary proposed in the letter was substantial. It was more money than Honora had seen in one place for years. A plan began to form behind her eyes. "Very well," she conceded, a new, calculating warmth in her tone. "You shall go.
It would be rude to refuse a duke.
Of course, as your guardian and benefactor, it is only right that I manage your earnings for you. You will be given a small allowance for your personal needs. The rest will come to me, for your keep and for the trouble of your upbringing. It was theft, plain and simple. But Prudence agreed without argument. The money was not the point. The point was the open door. The point was Kestrel Chase, a place miles from this house, miles from the constant wearing weight of her stepmother's disdain. She would be trading one form of servitude for another, but this one came with new scenery. It was a chance, a small one, but it was hers. Her arrival at Kestrel Chase was met with a profound silence. The great house stood against a grey sky, its stone facade handsome but austere. It was not a welcoming place. It was a fortress of grief. Inside, the air was cold and still, smelling of dust and disuse. A tall, severe-looking woman with her hair pulled into a tight bun met her in the grand entrance hall. This was Hannah, the housekeeper, whose loyalty to the late Duchess was the stuff of local legend. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, took in Prudence's mended travelling cloak and plain bonnet. There was no welcome in them, only scepticism. "The Duke is in his study. He will see you now," she said, her voice clipped. She led Prudence through echoing corridors, where furniture stood shrouded in white dustcloths, portraits on the walls obscured by grime. It was a house holding its breath. Gideon Devereux did not rise when she entered his study. He sat behind a massive oak desk, a sea of papers spread before him. The room was the only one in the house that seemed truly lived in, yet it was starkly functional. No fire burned in the hearth, despite the autumn chill. "Miss Bellamy," he said. It was not a question. "You are punctual." He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Your stepmother informed me you are proficient with accounts." "I am," Prudence replied, her voice steady. She would not be intimidated. This was a transaction, and she understood the terms. "Kestrel Chase is in disarray," he stated, his gaze direct and unnerving. "The ledgers have not been properly balanced in 2 years. The library is a disaster. The staff are adrift. My late wife managed these things. I do not have the aptitude for it." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "I require someone with a mind for detail and an aversion to hysterics. At the ball, I observed you. You possess both." It was the plainest, most unvarnished compliment she had ever received. It was not about her face or her form, but about her actions. It landed with the weight of solid fact. "The position is yours, if you want it," he continued. "Your duties will be the household accounts, the estate ledgers, and the complete cataloguing of the library. You will report to me, and only to me. You will have rooms in the East Wing. Are the terms acceptable?" "They are, Your Grace," she said. "Good," he said, and turned his attention back to his papers. "Hannah will show you to your rooms. You may begin tomorrow." The interview was over. Prudence began not with the ledgers, but with the library. It was a magnificent 2-story room, but it had fallen into neglect. Books lay in dusty piles, their spines cracked. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper. The staff watched her, Hannah in particular, with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. They expected her to issue a flurry of orders, to try and assert an authority she had not yet earned. Prudence did nothing of the sort. For the first week, She simply worked. She rose early, dressed in her simple grey frock, and entered the library as the sun rose. She worked methodically, section by section, taking down each book, dusting it carefully with a soft cloth, assessing its condition, and making a neat entry onto a sheet of paper. She learned the rhythms of the house. She learned the names of the maids, Tilly and Bess, and the footman, Jem.
She spoke to them quietly and respectfully, asking them where things were kept, never demanding. Hannah observed it all, her expression unreadable. On the third day, Prudence found a pot of fresh tea and a small plate of biscuits left on a table in the library. There was no note. On the fifth day, Hannah appeared in the doorway. "The east wing gets a terrible draught," the housekeeper stated, her arms crossed. "The chimney needs a good sweep. I'll have Ned see to it this afternoon. No sense in you catching a chill." It was not an offer of friendship. It was a concession. It was a grudging acknowledgement of Prudence's quiet, relentless industry. It was the beginning of a thaw. In her few hours of leisure in the late afternoons, Prudence discovered a small, walled garden behind the library. It had once been a place of beauty, but was now a tangled mess of weeds and overgrown rose bushes. A stone bench sat half-swallowed by ivy. It mirrored the house itself, a place of forgotten potential. She found a pair of old shears and some gloves in a potting shed and began, bit by bit, to reclaim it. She would spend an hour there each day, clearing the weeds, pruning the roses, turning the soil. It was hard, physical work that soothed the tired parts of her mind. She asked no one for help. It was her own secret project, a small corner of the world she could bring back to order. From his study window, which overlooked that very garden, Gideon watched her. He saw her kneeling in the dirt, her brow furrowed in concentration, her movements careful and deliberate. He saw the slow, steady progress she made, the choked roses being freed from the thorns, the stone path reappearing from beneath the weeds. He had not set foot in that garden since his wife's death. It had been her favorite place. Seeing Prudence there, not erasing what had been, but carefully tending to its remains, stirred something in him. It was not grief. It was something quieter, a sense of recognition. He began to notice other things. The dust cloths vanished from the furniture in the main hall, replaced by the gleam of polished wood. The scent of beeswax and lemon replaced the smell of dust. A fire was always lit in the main library now, its cheerful crackle a welcome sound. He heard the staff talking in the corridors, sometimes even laughing. Hannah had taken to humming, a tuneless sound that was nonetheless a sign of a settled heart. The house was breathing again. One evening, instead of having his dinner tray brought to his study as was his custom, he went to the formal dining room. The long table was empty, save for a single place setting at its head. He sent for Hannah. "Henceforth," he said, his voice rusty from disuse in the cavernous room, "I will take my meals here, and set a second place. Miss Bellamy will join me. We will discuss the household accounts." And so, a new routine began. Their dinners were silent, formal affairs at first. They sat at opposite ends of the vast table, the distance between them a chasm. Prudence would deliver her report on the day's progress in a clear, concise manner. He would listen, ask a few direct questions, and nod. But slowly, the space between them began to shrink. He moved her place-setting closer to his, first by a few feet, then to the seat directly to his right. The conversations drifted from accounts to books. He discovered her sharp, insightful mind, her deep love of history and poetry. She discovered a dry, understated wit beneath his somber exterior. He would ask about her garden, and she would describe the return of a particular songbird or the surprising bloom of a long dormant lily. He began to speak of Kestrel Chase, not as a burden, but as a legacy. He told her stories of his grandfather, who had planted the great oaks that lined the drive. He was sharing his home with her, not just its ledgers, but its soul. He found himself looking forward to these evenings, to the quiet intelligence in her eyes, to the calm sound of her voice filling the silence of his life. He was not a ghost anymore. He was a man sitting down to dinner, and he was not alone. The first sign of trouble arrived in a polished black carriage. Lady Honora and Arabella, having heard no scandalous reports of Prudence's dismissal, had decided to descend upon Kestrel Chase to inspect the situation for themselves. Honora swept into the great hall, her eyes darting everywhere, assessing the value of the tapestries, the quality of the silver. She treated Prudence with a cloying, false familiarity in front of the Duke, calling her, "My dear clever girl," while simultaneously undermining her with small, cutting remarks intended for his ears. "She has always been so determined," Honora said, a slight emphasis on the word that made it sound like a failing. "Quite the little manager. One almost forgets her station." Arabella was simply bored. She wandered through the grand rooms, pouting that it was all so grim and quiet. She complained about the lack of social calls and the distance from Marley. Her presence was a jarring note in the restored harmony of the house, a reminder of the life Prudence had escaped. Prudence endured their visit with her usual composure, treating them with a politeness that was as impenetrable as armor. She knew her stepmother was probing for weakness, for some sign that she could be dislodged and the Duke's patronage redirected to the more suitable Arabella. A more dangerous threat soon followed. Felicity Trent, having not given up her ambition to become the next Duchess of Kestrel Chase, began to make regular calls. She was beautiful, charming, and relentless. She saw at once the quiet rapport that had developed between the Duke and the woman in gray. She saw the way his eyes followed Prudence, the way the household staff deferred to her with genuine respect, and she saw a rival to be eliminated. Her campaign began with whispers in the drawing rooms of Marley. "It is so tragic," she would say to her audience, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The poor Duke, so lost in his grief. He is vulnerable. And that woman, well, she is clever. One must be in her position. It is a great deal of trust to place in a person with no family, no fortune of her own." The rumors grew, twisting and darkening. Prudence was not just an employee. She was an opportunist, manipulating a grieving man. Stories began to circulate that items were going missing from the estate, small things at first, then larger sums of money. Lady Honora, when questioned by her gossiping friends, would sigh dramatically and say, "Prudence always had such ambitions. I do hope she knows her place." She fed the fire, hoping its flames would consume Prudence and leave the way clear for a more profitable connection through Arabella. Felicity knew that whispers were not enough. She needed proof. She sought out a former clerk from the Kestrel Chase estate office, a man Gideon had dismissed a year prior for dishonesty. Mr. Farrow was a bitter, resentful man, and for a handsome sum, he was more than willing to help. He still had friends among the junior staff, and he knew the workings of the estate office. One rainy afternoon, when Prudence was occupied with the Duke, showing him a section of the newly restored library, Farrow gained access to the accounts office. He had with him a sample of Prudence's handwriting, meticulously copied from a household order. With a pot of fresh ink and a sharp pen,
He made a new entry in the main ledger, a large payment of £50 to a tradesman in a distant town, a man who did not exist. He carefully forged Prudence's signature at the bottom of the entry. The forgery was good. To a casual observer, it would look perfectly legitimate. It was a time bomb, waiting to explode. A week later, the Duke received a visitor. It was Mr. Pharaoh, presenting himself as a concerned party, a man whose conscience would not let him stay silent. With him, he brought Felicity Trent, who played the part of the reluctant, worried friend of the Duke's. "Your Grace," Pharaoh began, his voice oozing false sincerity, "it pains me to bring this to your attention, but there are irregularities in the estate accounts, sums of money that cannot be accounted for." Gideon listened, his face impassive. He sent for the ledger. Felicity laid a delicate hand on his arm.
Gideon, we were so worried. Perhaps it is just a mistake. A woman is not meant for such complex work. She must be overwhelmed.
The ledger was brought. Pharaoh opened it to the carefully prepared page. "Here, Your Grace, this payment of £50. I made inquiries. The supplier does not exist. The funds have simply vanished." He pointed to the signature. "And it is in Miss Bellamy's hand." Gideon looked at the entry. He saw the neat script, the familiar signature. He saw the damning evidence. For a single, cold moment, the man he had been for the past 2 years, the cynical, grief-stricken man who trusted no one, resurfaced. He had allowed himself to open a door, to let a little light in, and this was the result. Betrayal. It was a familiar, bitter taste. He felt the walls of his fortress begin to rise again. But then he thought of Prudence in the garden, her hands in the soil. He thought of her clear, direct gaze across the dinner table. He thought of her quiet competence that had breathed life back into his home. The evidence of his own eyes warred with the evidence on the page. He did not rage. He did not accuse. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "Fetch Miss Bellamy." Prudence entered the study and saw at once that something was wrong. The air was thick with tension. Felicity Trent sat in the visitor's chair, a look of feigned concern on her face. A man Prudence did not know stood by the desk, his expression smug. The Duke was standing by the window, his back to her. When he turned, his face was a mask of stone. "Miss Bellamy," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. He did not use her first name as he sometimes did during their evening conversations. He gestured to the open ledger on his desk. "Explain this entry." She walked toward the desk, her heart a cold, heavy weight in her chest. She looked down at the page. She saw the payment, the fictional supplier, and the signature that was a near-perfect copy of her own. She felt the trap spring shut around her. They expected her to panic, to weep, to deny it in a flurry of frantic words. They expected her to fall apart. She did none of those things. She straightened her shoulders and met the Duke's gaze. Her own was clear and unwavering. "I cannot explain it, Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly level. "Because I did not write it." She looked closer at the page, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "That is not my hand, though it is a skilled imitation, and the ink is fresher than the date suggests. It has not had time to fully oxidize. See how it shines under the light, compared to the entries above and below it."
Felicity gave a small, pitying laugh. Really, Miss Bellamy, desperate accusations will not help you. Prudence ignored her. She looked only at Gideon. Your Grace, may I retrieve my personal daybook from my office? He gave a single, sharp nod. She left the room and returned a moment later with a simple, cloth-bound book. It was her own private record, a habit she had maintained for years. In it, she meticulously logged every task she performed, every shilling she authorized for payment, every order she placed. She opened it to the date in question. On that day, she said, her finger tracing the neat script, I authorized 3 payments. £12 for beeswax from the chandler in Marley, £6 for seed from the nursery, and £2 for the mending of the stable roof. A total of £20.
There is no record of a £50 payment, because none was made. She turned the book for him to see. Her records were flawless, cross-referenced with receipts she kept filed in a small wooden box. The discrepancy was not just a matter of her word against the ledger, it was a matter of her meticulous, unimpeachable system against a single, fraudulent line. Gideon looked from her daybook to the forged entry. He looked at her calm, composed face. She had not offered excuses or emotional pleas. She had offered evidence. She had trusted him to see the truth. And in that moment, his last reservation dissolved. It was not pity he felt for her. It was something harder and more respectful. It was absolute trust. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she was telling the truth. He looked at Felicity and at the smirking Mr. Farrow, and for the first time in years, the cold stillness in his eyes was replaced by a dangerous fire. "Thank you, Miss Bellamy," he said, his voice low and resonant. "You may leave us. I will handle this." He knew now that this was not a simple matter of theft. It was an attack, and it would require not a quiet dismissal, but a public answer. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Gideon's response was not what Felicity or Lady Honora had expected. There was no quiet dismissal of Prudence, no scandal hushed up. Instead, a week later, invitations were sent from Kestrel Chase for a grand dinner. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of the most influential figures in the county: landowners, magistrates, and the undisputed queen of local society, the sharp-tongued dowager, Lady Rosamond Jardine. Lady Jardine was a woman whose opinion could make or break a reputation with a single, well-placed remark. She had, of course, heard the rumors swirling around the Duke's peculiar new archivist. Her acceptance of the invitation was a sign that she intended to see the situation for herself. Lady Honora, Arabella, and a triumphant Felicity Trent were, of course, also invited. Felicity arrived in a gown of emerald green, confident that this was the evening the Duke would finally announce her as his intended, now that the troublesome, poor relation was surely out of the way. The dinner was a lavish affair. Kestrel Chase was ablaze with light, the dining room gleaming with polished silver and crystal. Prudence was there, not as a manager overseeing the event from the shadows, but as a guest. At the Duke's specific instruction, she was seated to his right. She wore her best dress, a simple gown of deep blue that she had sewn herself. She was quiet and composed, enduring the curious stares and whispered comments with unshakable dignity. Felicity, seated further down the table, shot her venomous looks, furious that Prudence was present at all. The meal progressed, the conversation polite and strained. Finally, as the port was being served, Gideon rose to his feet. A hush fell over the room. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I have gathered you here tonight for a purpose. As many of you know, Kestrel Chase has been in a state of neglect for some time. But over the last few months, order has been restored. My house is alive again. And that is thanks to the tireless work and unimpeachable integrity of one person, Miss Prudence Bellamy." He gestured to Prudence, who inclined her head, her cheeks faintly colored. Felicity could not contain herself. "Oh, Your Grace, you are too generous," she said, her voice sweet as poison. "But one must be so careful. Trust is a fragile thing, especially when placed in those of a lower station, who may be tempted by such wealth." It was the opening Gideon had been waiting for. "An interesting observation, Miss Trent," he said, his voice turning to ice. "You speak, perhaps, of temptation? Of dishonesty?" He signaled to a footman, who brought a small table and placed it in the center of the room. On it, he placed the estate ledger and Prudence's cloth-bound daybook. "Some of you may have heard rumors of financial irregularities on my estate, rumors that sought to cast doubt upon Miss Bellamy's character. I believe it is time to bring the facts into the light." He explained the situation calmly and precisely. He described the forged entry, and then he presented Prudence's own meticulous records as a contrast. "However," he continued, his eyes locking onto Felicity, "I was not content to leave it there. I invited another guest tonight." He gestured to a quiet man at the end of the table, whom no one had paid much mind. "Magistrate Ingram of Marley, who has a particular expertise in legal documents and handwriting." The magistrate rose and approached the table. He examined the ledger with a small lens, his face grim. The room was utterly silent. "Your Grace," Ingram announced, his voice booming in the stillness, "this entry is a clear and recent forgery. The ink is different, the pressure of the pen inconsistent with the surrounding text. The signature is a fair copy, but it lacks the natural flow of a true hand. It was done by someone attempting to imitate, not to write." A collective gasp went through the room. Felicity Trent's face had gone pale as death. "This is preposterous," she stammered. "Is it?" Gideon's voice was like the crack of a whip. "Because the forger, a Mr. Farrow, has already provided a full confession. He was quite forthcoming when faced with the prospect of prison. He produced a folded document, a sworn statement detailing how he was paid a handsome sum by Miss Felicity Trent to fabricate this evidence and ruin an innocent woman's name." All eyes turned to Felicity. She looked trapped, her polished facade crumbling to reveal the raw panic beneath. She turned to Lady Honora for support, but Prudence's stepmother was already trying to distance herself from the disaster. "I knew it was a foolish risk," Honora blurted out, her voice high and shrill. "I told Felicity it would not work. I warned her." In trying to save herself, she had confirmed her own complicity. She had known about the plot all along. The public humiliation was absolute. It was a spectacular, catastrophic implosion. Lady Rosamond Jardine watched the entire scene, a slow smile spreading across her wrinkled face. She raised her glass in a silent, deliberate toast, not to the Duke, but to Prudence. It was a gesture of supreme social approval, a signal to everyone present
that the old guard had chosen its side. Felicity Trent was ruined. Lady Honora was exposed. And Prudence Bellamy, the woman in the simple dress, sat with quiet dignity, her name not just cleared, but burnished bright. After the last of the scandalized guests had departed, a profound quiet settled over Kestrel Chase. Prudence stood alone in the great hall, the adrenaline of the evening leaving her feeling strangely hollow. The battle was won, but the future was a blank, uncertain page. She heard footsteps on the marble floor and turned to see Gideon approaching. He stopped a few feet from her, his face serious in the flickering candlelight. "They sought to ruin your name," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the vast space. "Instead, they revealed your worth to all." He took a step closer. "For 2 years this house was a tomb, a house of ghosts. You have brought it back to life. For 2 years," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "I have been a ghost. You have brought me back to life." Prudence's breath caught in her throat. She could not speak. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the walls around his heart come down entirely. She saw not the Duke, not the grieving widower, but the man, Gideon, looking at her with an emotion so raw and open, it made her tremble. Then, to her astonishment, he went down on one knee. He did not have a ring. He did not offer poetry or grand pronouncements of passion. His proposal was like the man himself, plain, direct, and utterly sincere. "I am not asking you as a duke to an employee," he said, his eyes holding hers. "I am asking as a man who sees you, plainly, wholly. Prudence Bellamy, will you be my wife? Will you be the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, not by station, but by choice? Will you stay and build a life with me, here, in the home you have already saved?" Tears she had refused to shed for years of cruelty and neglect now welled in her eyes. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief, the release of a breath she had been holding her entire life. She did not need to be rescued. She needed to be seen. And he saw her. "Yes," she whispered. The word was small, but it filled the entire hall. "Yes, Gideon. Plainly, yes." 1 year later, the walled garden behind the library was a riot of color and scent. The roses, pruned and tended, climbed the old stone walls in a profusion of crimson and white. The stone bench, now free of ivy, offered a place to sit and listen to the hum of bees. It was here that Prudence, now the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, often sat with her husband. The transformation of the garden mirrored the transformation of the house and of their lives. Kestrel Chase was no longer a silent monument to grief. It was a home, filled with warmth, light, and the sound of quiet laughter. Hannah, her severe bun slightly loosened, now smiled more often than not. Lady Rosamond Jardine was a frequent visitor, her sharp wit a welcome addition to their peaceful evenings. A letter had arrived that morning from Arabella. She had married a minor baronet, a quiet man with a kind face and a modest estate in the north. Her life was not the glittering social triumph Lady Honora had planned for her, but her letter, for all its clumsy phrasing, held a note of genuine contentment. "I am sorry for the matter of the gown," she had written, "and for all the rest. Stepmother was wrong. You were always the clever one. I hope you are happy." It was not a perfect apology, but it was a sincere one. Prudence had folded the letter and placed it in her desk, a quiet closing of a painful chapter. Lady Honora, her social standing in Marley destroyed, had retreated to a small, rented house in Bath, where her airs and graces found little purchase. Her punishment was not poverty, but irrelevance. As Prudence sat on the bench, watching the last of the afternoon sun filter through the leaves, Gideon came to join her. He carried a long, flat box in his hands. He sat beside her and placed it on her lap. "I had something made for you," he said. She opened the box. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a dress. It was made of the finest, softest silk imaginable, tailored with exquisite skill. And it was the color of a dove's wing. It was gray. "It is the color I first saw you in," he said softly, his hand covering hers on the box. "The night you saved my tapestry and my house, and very possibly my soul. To others it may be a plain color, but to me it has always been the color of strength, of integrity, of the woman I love." She lifted her eyes to his, her heart full. He had not tried to dress her in the bright, frivolous colors of the world she had left behind. He had honored the person she had always been. She took his hand, her fingers lacing with his, and together they looked out over the thriving garden and the warm stone of their home. The past was not erased, but it had been integrated, its wounds healed. They had built a new life, not on the ashes of the old one, but in the carefully tended soil of what remained. It was a life built on quiet competence, on plain speech, and on the profound, unshakable truth of being seen for exactly who you were. Together. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end.
Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.